Good morning. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? I've been asked to begin with a brief biographical statement. And you can see on the screen there that my name is James Lee Ray. I thought I'd spend just a second talking about my name, actually. I used to go in my earlier years, I went by James L. Ray, and I was living in Bolivia for a reason I will get to. When I heard on a static radio broadcast the news about Martin Luther King's assassination, and for a couple of days I thought they were saying James L. Ray. When I found out his name was James Earl Ray, I started using my middle name to distinguish myself from James Earl Ray. One result of that is that sometimes, every once in a while, I get a communication addressed to James E. Ray, which defeats the purpose, of course. But I was born and raised in northwestern Ohio. My academic career, as far as higher education goes, began at Ohio State University, where I actually lived in the football stadium all 4 years. And I'm not exaggerating or engaging in hyperbole. I lived in the football stadium, even though I was not a football player. There was a scholarship dormitory in the football stadium. And then I had 2 years in the Peace Corps in Bolivia. That's why I was in Bolivia in the 1960s. I got my postgraduate degree, PhD, from the University of Michigan. It must happen, but I have never encountered any political scientist in my life who has undergraduate degree from Ohio State and a graduate degree from the University of Michigan. And my specialty in graduate school was international conflict. I've had positions at a small college in upstate New York at the University of New Mexico and Florida State University before I came here in 1997. Now, I am glad to be here for this occasion this morning for at least a couple of reasons. One is that I've talked to my colleagues who've addressed you before, and they tell me that this is a very good group, that this is a very good class, that you are attentive and engaged and well-informed, and that you do your reading assignments. I hope you've done your reading assignments for today, because I like to give pop quizzes. So that's one reason. The other reason is that, in fact, I feel pretty well placed to discuss the topic for today, because I started getting into, in a serious way, American foreign policy 7 or 8 years ago. And I started teaching courses about it. And in 2007 or so, I wrote my own book for the course on American foreign policy that I teach. And that book is based on a premise for the analysis of foreign policy that is somewhat different from the more traditional, most orthodox mainline premise. The more traditional orthodox mainline premise for analyses of not only American foreign policy, but foreign policies of states in general, is that states follow the national interest defined in terms of power. That's a kind of mainstream orthodox premise for analyzing foreign policy. The premise on which my book is based is not that states follow the national interest, but that political leaders want primarily to stay in power. Now that is not a new idea. That's not my idea. Machiavelli, to some important extent, has that premise in The Prince. But there has been a real emphasis in the last 10, 15 years among my colleagues in political science who have decided that a more useful premise for the analysis. Did I do something? There's a booby trap there or something.
You must stay in the middle. right or left in here.
Anyway, where was I? There's this premise about leaders wanting to stay in power. A lot of my colleagues in the field have adopted that as a major premise. It leads to interesting distinctions between analyses based on the premise that states follow the national interest defined in terms of power. And I will elaborate on some of the distinctions that come out when you use instead the premise that leaders want to stay in power. Now, one of the reasons I like that premise, and one of the reasons it has become very popular in recent academic work on foreign policy, is that it emphasizes the impact of domestic politics on foreign policy. Some of the more extreme versions of the states follow the national interest approaches, some of the more important as well as extreme versions of that kind of approach de-emphasize political or domestic politics and go so far as to claim that it really makes no difference, that a state is a state is a state, like a rose is a rose is a rose, they all follow the national interest. Democratic states, autocratic states, domestic politics don't matter. That can be an implication of states follow the national interest kinds of analyses. But if you focus on a premise instead that leaders want to stay in power, it kind of naturally and very logically leads to the focus on the fact that political leaders have competitors with which they must deal. And they have to deal not only with foreign competitors, but they have to deal with domestic competitors. Now, leaders can lose power in competition with foreign competitors. Saddam Hussein, for example, is a recent example of a leader who lost power because he got involved in this struggle with the United States. But that's unusual. Most leaders in most states, and certainly in the United States, most leaders are not threatened with losing power because of competition with foreign competitors. Most leaders, if they're going to lose power, the threat comes rather from domestic competitors. And if you focus on domestic competitors, of course, you are focusing on domestic politics. So the approach that I took in my book on American foreign policy stresses the impact of domestic politics on foreign policy. And so fits very well with the topic for the day about polarization in modern American politics and American foreign policy. So that's the topic, and there's a kind of general academic instinct or tendency to believe that if you want to understand a phenomenon or a situation of contemporary relevance, you really need to understand its historical roots. And my inclination would be to go back to the historical roots all the way to Adam and Eve, or at least Cain and Abel. But I'll resist that temptation. And I'll mention briefly that in the 1930s, for example, the Democratic Party may have been somewhat more zealous in its anti-Nazi, anti-fascist instincts than the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party was somewhat more isolationist than the Democratic Party. Franklin Roosevelt, it's pretty clear from private records, was not isolationist. He felt he had to be isolationist for much of his early years in office, but he really felt that the United States should get involved in World War II, but he knew that there was no domestic political support for it. But the Japanese solved that problem for him when they attacked at Pearl Harbor, and then Adolf Hitler solved the other problem for him by declaring war, pretty needlessly and maybe foolishly, in the wake of the attack at Pearl Harbor. So then he could indulge his more interventionist, more internationalist instincts that he felt. So that brings us up to the post-World War II era on which I'm going to focus in terms of my analysis of the roots of the current situation. And I want to argue first that the Chinese Revolution in 1949 had a really polarizing impact on domestic politics in the United States, and a polarizing impact on foreign policy debate. Now let me just stop here a second and give a couple of you a chance to intervene and provide some input here. The theme I want to pursue in the early part here has to do with a distinction or a comparison between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and the roles they played in the policies they adopted during the Cold War. And the question from which I would like to hear maybe one person on each side, I'm going to arbitrarily pick one person if any of you are inclined to participate here. The question I want to pursue has to do with which party during the Cold War had more hardline, more consistently zealous anti-communist policies. Was it the Democratic Party or was it the Republican Party? Now for some of you may that seem like a trick question perhaps even, but let me get, if any of you, one or two of you are inclined to participate, let me ask first if you would argue that the Republican Party had more consistently hardline, zealous anti-communist foreign policy during the Cold War. Would you make that argument, and would you elaborate in a sentence or two in that argument? Anybody inclined to defend the Republicans in this respect? Yes.
I'm thinking back,
Right.
which was a long way, and I am recalling McCarthy.
Right.
And if we could take him
Right.
as a representative,
Right.
then that would argue for the
Republicans. Okay.
What was your comment?
The comment is that Joseph McCarthy was a Republican, and if we took him as an example, that would support the argument that Republicans were more consistently, zealously hardline on anti-communist. I think that's a plausible and legitimate input. So that's one argument in favor of the Republican Party. Is anybody here inclined to argue in contrast that the Democratic Party was actually more consistently hardline anti-communist? Yes.
Well, let's see. Kennedy, I think, he ran basically on a strong anti-communist, defensive kind of posture, and then Johnson certainly carried that out in Vietnam.
Okay. Excellent points in favor of the Democratic Party, which I will repeat since you can't hear. The point was that John F. Kennedy ran on a kind of hardline Cold War policy. The Eisenhower administration had allowed the missile gap to develop, which, by the way, was totally false. But and Lyndon Johnson certainly followed that up in Vietnam. So, what is my argument? Well, my argument begins with the communist revolution in China. That was really traumatic for the United States. The United States had fought in World War II, and of course at great cost in blood and treasure had defeated the fascists, the Nazis, the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans, and it felt entitled in the wake of that tremendously costly effort to a period of tranquility and peace. And instead it found itself first confronted with this massive threat from the Soviet Union. And then, at about the same time the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb, the most populous country in the world went through a communist revolution. And I think it's fair to say that most Americans felt that the Chinese loved us. We sent missionaries there, we sent food there for the starving children of China, and they loved us. That was the general impression that Americans had about China. And now they had this revolution leading to a government which made all kinds of scurrilous, horribly negative statements about the United States. It was a real trauma. And it led a lot of Americans to think that somebody must have conspired against the United States. And if you remember the era of McCarthyism, there was this general argument that the State Department was infiltrated with communists, that Dean Acheson was sympathetic to communists, that the Democratic Party was rife with communist sympathizers. And I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on McCarthyism, except to make the point that this event traumatized the Democratic Party. And it made the Democratic Party, I mean, I'm sure it felt this before, but it made the Democratic Party especially sympathetic to the charges of being soft on communism. And the general theme I'm going to develop in the next few minutes here is that because the Democratic Party felt vulnerable to these charges of being soft on communism, it pursued a more consistently hardline anti-communist, anti-Soviet foreign policy. That Democratic presidents were more hardline and more zealously anti-communist than Republican presidents were. Now, let me develop that argument. And I want to develop it first by talking about how Republicans were relatively conciliatory compared to Democrats. Now, before I get into that, let me say in passing, however, in relation to the theme, I mean, the theme today talks about polarization of American politics today, and it certainly is polarized, and I'm sure Mike Hetherington and John Geer have dealt with that. I do want to say, before I get into this business in comparing Republicans and Democrats, that yes, it is very polarized today, American politics, but I get the impression that the emphasis on polarization today gives an exaggerated impression of how bipartisan American politics have been since World War II. I mean, McCarthyism is an example. There was very bitter polarization of politics in the 1950s, McCarthy being a prominent example. And of course, the Vietnam War polarized American politics. Lyndon Johnson reached the point where he could not go out in public without being confronted with demonstrators who were shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many babies have you killed today?" Now, admittedly, that wasn't coming from the right or the Republicans, but the politics of the 60s were embittered. And then, of course, Nixon was hounded right out of office in the 1970s, and Ronald Reagan evoked a lot of passionate anti-Republican Party spirit. There were demonstrations, 1 million strong in various places, the nuclear freeze movement in here and the United States. And Bill Clinton was impeached. So yes, it's very polarized today, but it's never been all that. You know, the bipartisanship in American politics has always been somewhat attenuated. There's been bitter disputes before now. But my argument here is, to begin with, that because Democrats felt vulnerable, they ended up adopting policies that were more hardline than those of the Republican Party. So let me just talk about a few examples here. Eisenhower, of course, pledged in the election that he would go to Korea, and he accepted a tie in Korea. He accepted a less than a victorious outcome for the United States in Korea than, I would argue, than any Democratic president probably could have accepted, or probably would have accepted. So that was the beginning of it. The Eisenhower administration, or rather the Eisenhower campaign, was based on a promise to roll back the Iron Curtain. So there was some very vigorous anti-communist rhetoric in the election of 1952, which, by the way, was an example of bitter partisan divides. I mean, an important Republican slogan of that campaign was "Korea, corruption, and communism." That was what they, the charges they made against the Democratic Party. But when the Soviet Union attacked Hungary in 1956, in spite of the promises or the kind of campaign slogan of the Republicans that they would roll back the Iron Curtain, the Eisenhower administration did nothing effective. When I started teaching in the 70s, I encountered Hungarian students whose antagonism to Eisenhower was very passionate because they felt he had misled them, that he had said, we're going to roll back the Iron Curtain, and they responded to that appeal, and then he did nothing. So that's the beginning of an argument that the Republicans were actually, relatively speaking, somewhat conciliatory or less hardline than Democrats. Nixon, much like Eisenhower, accepted a tie in Vietnam in order to get a peace settlement. And that peace settlement, I don't know if you were aware or remember, that peace settlement allowed the North Vietnamese to keep their troops in the South. Not only to keep their troops in the South, but to resupply their troops in the South. Could a Democratic president have accepted a settlement like that? I would be inclined to say no. I could not. The screams about being soft on communism would have been deafening if any Democratic president had accepted a tie and allowed the North to keep troops in the South. So the tie turned out to be temporary, as that points out there. So that was one conciliatory thing that Nixon did. And it's kind of a commonplace observation that Nixon was able to reestablish ties with what was called in those days Red China. Nixon and Kissinger arranged a rapprochement with China, even security cooperation with China. Could a Democratic president have done that? Would a Democratic president have done that? Well, it's counterfactual. We don't know for sure, but a lot of analysts think the answer to that question is no. This is only something that a hardline anti-communist Republican like Nixon could pull off, would be to reestablish ties, or to not reestablish, but to make some contact with and establish a working relationship with communist China. And of course, we are aware that the Cold War ended in 1989, 1991, somewhere in there, but we tend to forget perhaps that that was really the second time the Cold War ended. The Cold War ended, a lot of people talked about it ending in the 1970s because President Nixon and Kissinger not only reestablished ties with communist China, established détente with the Soviet Union, signed the SALT Treaty, limiting the growth in nuclear weapons. And so Nixon was perhaps a prominent example, the most prominent example of somebody who rhetorically was, and by image, quite anti-communist, but nevertheless, if you look at his foreign policies, was quite conciliatory, relatively speaking, toward the Soviet Union, toward China, during the Cold War. Now, Reagan is a hard case, and I admit that. And I would even admit that Reagan's hardline policies may have played an important role in bringing the Cold War to an end. He clearly began as a hardline anti-communist. In his second term, however, he became quite conciliatory and signed the treaty cutting back nuclear weapons. So even he fits the pattern to some extent of a Republican who, despite the image of Republicans to the contrary, was capable of and did pursue quite conciliatory policies, relatively speaking, toward the Soviet Union. Now, the other side of the coin, the Democratic Party. I don't know how surprising this is to you in general, but I want to argue that the Democratic Party was actually more a hard line. I'm tempted to say in passing that for those of you who might be suspecting that this means that I'm a Democrat and my presentation is biased in favor of the Democratic Party, You know, that may or may not be the case, but many of these policies that the Democratic Party followed, I was not in agreement with. So I'm not pointing with pride to all these Democratic policies. I'm making the argument that the Democratic Party was, and Democratic presidents were, pretty consistently zealously anti-communist and hardline during the Cold War. Truman, of course, promulgated the Truman Doctrine, calling for the United States to resist, basically, communist expansion wherever it occurred, and he did respond to the attack by the North Koreans on the South Koreans, and so began this kind of pattern of Democratic presidents being hardline. Then we have John F. Kennedy, that we've already talked about to some extent. John F. Kennedy carried out the Bay of Pigs invasion, invasion against the Castro regime, carried out by some Cuban exiles organized by the CIA. In fact, I have read that CIA agents were actually the first people who landed on the beaches in Cuba. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis with that question mark up there. What is that all about? Well, it has to do with the fact that, you know, one counter-argument to the kind of theme I'm developing here, which, let me admit, in a conciliatory fashion, is one-sided. I'm making a point here. I'm not trying to do a biased or a balanced analysis of Republican and Democratic foreign policies. If you were going to add some balance, you would point out that the Bay of Pigs invasion was actually the idea of the Republican Party. It had been organized before John F. Kennedy was elected. And in fact, it may have been the idea of Richard Nixon. Fidel Castro came to power. He soon came to the United States to visit. Eisenhower ostentatiously left town to play golf. Whether this was a policy statement or just love of golf, I'm not sure, but he left town so that Fidel Castro spent an hour or two talking to Richard Nixon in his role as vice president. And Richard Nixon left that meeting reportedly, and I think the reports are believable and legitimate. He left that meeting and wrote a memo to the CIA, and he said, this guy's a communist, and I think we ought to do what we can to get rid of him. And that may have been the birthplace of this idea about organizing exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow the Castro regime. Just let me mention also in passing, you know, talk about a long living issue. I just heard this morning Newt Gingrich promising to liberate Cuba and berating the Obama administration for paying too much attention to the Arab Spring and he should focus more on a Cuban Spring, and he is going to liberate Cuba. So it was Nixon's idea perhaps, the Republicans organized it, Kennedy gets elected, but the Nixon-Kennedy debates, and I still remember this. I mean, it's a long time ago, and I was in high school, but I still remember this particular occurrence in the debates between Nixon and Kennedy, the televised debates. Kennedy brought up the issue of Cuba and criticized the Eisenhower administration for standing idly by and letting Castro take over in Cuba. And he said, if I'm elected, I'm going to organize exiles, and we're going to liberate Cuba. Well, put yourself in Richard Nixon's shoes. On this televised debate, you know that the Republicans, his administration, is in fact in the middle of organizing exiles to invade Cuba. In fact, it may have been his idea, and here your opponent is giving you a hard time for, you know, sloth in relation to this threat from Cuba. What do? You can't say what he, I'm sure, would love to have said. What a good idea. It's so good that we're already in the process of doing it. He can't say that. It's, of course, supposed to be a secret. So what he says is, I am shocked that this young, inexperienced Kennedy would propose a policy of this kind that would violate international law and violate 13 treaties to which the United States is the party. He gets all huffy on his moral high horse. But you can imagine how furious he must have been. because he believed, and he believed till his dying day, and I suspect he was right, that Kennedy had been briefed on this. I mean, this was going to take place, if he were elected, it was going to take place on his watch. They knew that. It seems very likely that he knew, Kennedy knew, that the Bay of Pigs plan was underway, and yet he berated Nixon and the Eisenhower administration for letting Castro exist. And then Kennedy gets elected, and my speculation is, and that's why I have a question mark there, the speculation is not as well accepted as I think it should be, given the evidence. Kennedy felt that he had to do something very active to get rid of the Castro regime in anticipation of the election of 1964, because he figured that Barry Goldwater would establish effectively that Kennedy had been advised about the Bay of Pigs operation, which the Republicans had organized to begin with, and yet had used that issue against Nixon, knowing that the Republicans had started to organize the Bay of Pigs, that he would be humiliated by Goldwater making this charge, and it was pretty early on that the conclusion came to the fore that Goldwater would be the opponent. Kennedy used this issue, knowing that the Republicans had organized an invasion by rebels. And then, of course, when the invasion took place, from the Republican point of view and the point of view of others, he screwed it up. He didn't provide air support that was needed by the rebels when they invaded Cuba. He figured that that would be such an embarrassment that he had to get rid of the Cuban regime, the Castro regime. So he decided to invade Cuba and get rid of Castro. So, and this is where it gets controversial, and I'm not saying you should accept this as gospel, but if you ask me, why did the Russians put missiles in Cuba? I will tell you, the Russians put missiles in Cuba because they got wind of the fact that Kennedy was about to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. Pierre Salinger, John Kennedy's press secretary, says that's true. That's what happened. John F. Kennedy was so desperate to get rid of the Castro regime that he decided to invade and depose the Castro regime. Robert McNamara says, the Secretary of State for Kennedy, well, yes, Kennedy had such a plan. He had even initiated the plan, had set it in motion, but McNamara says he had not finally made up his mind. Maybe. Even McNamara says, if I were the Russians and I saw what the Russians saw and I had seen what the Russians had seen, I would have concluded that the Kennedy administration, the United States, was about to invade Cuba and depose Castro. So the Cuban Missile Crisis may belong on this list as an example of a hardline policy of a Democratic president. So I've got it there at least tentatively with a question mark. And then, of course, Kennedy did send 15,000 troops to the war in Vietnam. There's a lot of speculation about whether or not the war in Vietnam would have been pursued with as much vigor had Kennedy not been shot. I suspect it would have been. But we'll never know, of course. What we do know is that Lyndon Johnson came to power, and one of his hardline policies was to invade the Dominican Republic in 1965. I don't know how vivid your memory might be of this event. Maybe you have no memory of it whatsoever. President Johnson perceived a threat, a communist threat in the Dominican Republic, and he sent in troops to quell that threat. The State Department, while that invasion was taking place, or that intervention was taking place, the State Department issued a list of 106 communists that it said, the State Department said, were active in the Dominican Republic at that point, thus justifying this intervention by American troops. The New York Times, within a matter of days, if not hours, published a story which I have never seen rebutted, and the State Department certainly did not rebut. The New York Times published a story establishing that all but 5 of these 106 people were either out of the country, in jail, or dead. Now, to which the State Department said something like, it doesn't take very many communists to cause a whole lot of trouble. But the point here is, this is a hardline anti-communist policy, typical, I would argue, of Democrats, Democratic administrations. And Johnson, of course, sent 500 troops to Vietnam. That was the ultimate hardline policy. And I should say in passing that, and I don't mean to inculcate cynicism as much as these statements sound like, but I would argue he did that not because he was concerned about communism in Southeast Asia. He was genuinely concerned about that. I'm not accusing him of total cynicism, but I would argue he was more concerned about what Republicans would do to him if Vietnam would fall to the communists during his time in office. And he talked quite openly about that, not in public so much, but it's clear that was a major concern of his, that he would lose his great society, that he would lose the election, that he could not, as a Democrat, allow communism to take over South Vietnam, and he made a quite determined effort to prevent it. Now, we get to Carter. I think Carter's coming up next, and you're probably thinking, aha, now you're in trouble. Surely you cannot argue that Jimmy Carter was hardline, zealous anti-communist. Well, that's what I'm going to argue. Probably that he was more zealous than you know. And the story begins here. You know that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. What you may not know, and this is well established, and Robert Gates says that in his book, the former Secretary of Defense for both the previous 2 presidents, Jimmy Carter had a national security advisor named Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose anti-communism is beyond dispute. And he claims credit for this idea. He told Jimmy Carter, he persuaded Jimmy Carter to have the CIA support mujahideen elements and Islamic elements in Afghanistan to subvert the current socialist government in Afghanistan. And Zbigniew Brzezinski told Jimmy Carter that if the CIA did this, if the United States government did this, that the Soviet Union would probably invade. And he wanted them to invade, and Jimmy Carter wanted them to invade. They thought, they hoped that Afghanistan would turn into the Vietnam for the Soviet Union. So Ronald Reagan supported the Islamist elements. That's much more well known and contributed probably significantly to the Soviet defeat there. But it was originally Jimmy Carter's idea and Zbigniew Brzezinski's idea. And in fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski is quite happy to take credit for the end of the Cold War, that he started the downfall of the Soviet Union by initiating this plan to get the Soviets to attack Afghanistan. And then, of course, when they did that, it gave Carter the opportunity, which I think he understood. I mean, there are interesting survey studies of this time period which show that the American public, in a quite perhaps intelligent fashion actually, tends to give credit to presidents they perceive to be naturally inclined to be too soft when they take hardline policies. And presidents like Reagan, who they perceive maybe has naturally too hardline, when they take more conciliatory policies, they give approval to presidents who do that. Carter understood as the election approached in 1980, he was in trouble. He was perceived to be too soft line, not strong enough. It is amusing, I think, to remember Carter's response to the attack by the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Remember what his response was? I am shocked. I've learned more about the Soviet Union in the last 2 weeks than I had in my whole life put together. He was berated for that. It must have given him great satisfaction to think to himself, yeah, you're criticized, you don't understand. I'm not shocked. I expected this I tried to bring it about. But when he did bring it about, in a way which I would argue, again, he expected and hoped would help his election chances, he boycotted the Olympics, increased defense expenditures, eliminated grain shipments, adopted a pretty hardline policy. So that's my argument. Democratic presidents were consistently hardline. Then we get to the end of the Cold War, and a period which is kind of anomalous because it's between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the war on terrorism. I'm running out of time here to some extent, so let me just say a brief couple of words about this kind of interim place where this pattern probably doesn't apply. George H.W. Bush became president. He dealt with the end of the Cold War in a way which could be perceived as partisan, perhaps, I suppose. I'm tempted, for my own purposes that I will get back to observe what a tremendously well-qualified candidate for president George H.W. Bush was. To somewhat, I'm comparing him to current Republican candidates in that regard, but you think about George H.W. Bush, he was elected to Congress, he was ambassador to the UN, he was the director of the CIA, he was envoy to China, he was vice president for 8 years. I mean, it's not clear that there was a better qualified candidate for president in the history of the country. And I'm going to come back to why that's relevant, but I will leave him for the moment by saying, and I think that experience paid off, that he had a quite successful foreign policy. And then you have Bill Clinton. He wasn't so vulnerable to the charge of being certainly not soft on communism. The Cold War was over. He wasn't vulnerable to the charge of being soft on terrorism. 9/11 hadn't occurred yet. So we go to 9/11, and now I want to make the argument that in a way which is somewhat analogous to the Cold War, not perfectly analogous, Democrats feel more vulnerable to the charge of being soft on national security, soft on terrorism to some extent. I don't want to pursue the line of argument too much that Obama's policies have been more hardline than George Bush's. But I'm definitely going to argue that President Obama's foreign policies have been much more hardline than they would be were it not for the fact that he, like Democrats at least since the Second World War, feels vulnerable to the charge of being soft on national security. And he has adopted policies to protect himself in a typical Democratic fashion. He did wind down the war in Iraq, but he really did that on Bush's schedule, even though he was very critical during the campaign of the war in Iraq. He didn't leave American troops behind as he had planned, as Bush had planned. It was really a problem with the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government wouldn't grant American troops immunity from legal prosecution, so he took the troops out, left them fairly close by. But despite his criticism of the war in Iraq, and he kept saying that's the wrong war, the war in Afghanistan is the right war, he didn't come in and just wind it down rapidly. He stuck to George Bush's schedule. And that's because, in part, he understood that he couldn't afford as a Democrat to do otherwise. And of course, you are aware that there was the surge in Afghanistan. He went through a long period of decision-making on this point, and a lot of elements in his party wanted to wind down the war in Afghanistan quickly, but he decided instead to send more troops than George Bush had sent to Afghanistan and adopt a more vigorous, more energetic, more ambitious policy in Afghanistan than George W. Bush had followed. He, as he said last night, he killed Osama bin Laden. Is that more hardline? Well, in a way it is more hardline because, I don't want to get too much into this, it's complicated, but George W. Bush kind of gave up on killing Osama bin Laden. He started off chasing him and making that a high priority, and we're going to get him dead or alive, but then he said, after a while, one man's not that important. We don't really care about Osama bin Laden. We're going to focus on Iraq. Barack Obama focused on Afghanistan, focused on the killing of Osama bin Laden. He uses drones to kill terrorists, including American citizens. That person in Yemen, you know, as a candidate, he criticized Bush for stomping on American human rights, and now is using drones to kill American citizens if they happen to be terrorists in his view. He promised, of course, repeatedly to shut down the installation in Guantanamo, but he has kept it open and shows no sign of being able to close it. And he initiated the intervention in Libya, a military intervention, so that not only has he pursued the war in Iraq and pursued more energetically than the previous administration, the war in Afghanistan, he's initiated a new military adventure or initiative in Libya. Why did he do that? Well, because he wanted to establish his bona fides as not soft on national security, but also because President Clinton felt quite guilty about not taking effective action in Rwanda in 1994. The United States stood by while this crisis unfolded in Rwanda. 800,000 people were killed in civil strife in Rwanda. Bill Clinton later apologized for that. This woman, on the cover of a journal called National Interest, this is Samantha Power. She wrote a book about that incident, that tragedy in Rwanda, and really excoriated the inactivity of the United States and the Western community, Western world, in the face of that tragedy. Samantha Power is reputed by various commentators to be the kind of power behind the throne in the Obama administration in terms of foreign policy. She has a second-tier position in the National Security Council. She clearly argued passionately, I'm in this administration. The Clinton administration stood idly by while 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda. I'm in this administration. This administration is not going to stand idly by and let Gaddafi slaughter people in the tens of thousands in Libya. She was very influential in getting this carried out. And of course, Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State, and she's married to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton feels guilty about Rwanda, so she added her 2 bits to this idea of the military intervention in Libya, which, by the way, and we probably have not time to get into this, I will mention before I move on, I think was not a good idea. It's working out now. It looks all right now. It's not likely Republicans will make an issue of it because things are looking all right, looking pretty good now. I think in the long run, it will turn out not to have been a good idea. Well, let me not respond to that question. Maybe if you have a question afterward, I can't explain that, but I want to stick to more closely to the theme, which is that Obama's had a relatively hardline policy. He has extended sanctions on Iran. He's organized more effective sanctions on Iran. Is there polarization about Iran? I don't think so. He's been quite vigorous in his anti-Iranian policy. The Republican Party is all over the lot on this issue. Santorum has promised ahead of time to bomb it, and Romney and Gingrich give Obama a hard time on it, but it's not clear what they would do differently. And of course, Ron Paul lets Iran be Iran. He would just let it alone altogether. So I don't think there's polarization on this issue. I don't think Obama is vulnerable to criticism. This next point that I have to skim over here relatively quickly, this hasn't gotten much publicity, but a lot of people have observed for quite some time now that probably Asia and China are going to supplant terrorism and Al-Qaeda in the Middle East as the major foreign policy issue. That the confrontation with China or the relationship with China is going to become increasingly important as the confrontation with al-Qaeda and terrorism and Islamists, fundamentalist Islamists, fades into the background. And the Obama administration has clearly, even though it's gotten so far very little publicity for this, has clearly seen that happening, and I want to argue here quickly, is positioning itself to be able to say during the election, we are vigorously dealing with the problem of China. There were nuclear subs surfacing simultaneously in July of 2010. The Secretary of Defense proposed expanded military cooperation with Indonesia in 2010. Secretary of State Clinton reestablished full military ties with New Zealand. Ties with New Zealand had gotten worn thin in some ways. Secretary of State Clinton dealt with that. 2011, U.S. transfer operational command to South Korean forces was postponed. This, I think, is the most interesting. It's gotten the least publicity. The U.S. has been conducting joint military operations with Vietnam and even has declared an interest in a strategic partnership with Vietnam. And that all fits into this pattern. Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton suggests that Cambodia establish foreign policy independence from China. 2011, U.S. expands military cooperation with the Philippines. This got some publicity. Obama went to Australia and established a quasi-military base in Australia. Altogether, this is quite an impressive initiative. The Chinese are very sensitive to this and quite concerned. They feel encircled by the Obama administration. And you could put in this list perhaps the increasingly close relationship with Myanmar, Burma. Secretary of State's gone to Burma, another example of the Obama administration pursuing a vigorous foreign policy, energetic foreign policy, partly in defense of a threat that the Republicans will criticize him for being soft on national security. Okay. I think this is all partly because of current polarization in the American political system and Obama trying to protect himself from being charged with being soft on national security. Paradoxically, it means that I don't think there is much polarization on foreign policy issues. If you look at domestic issues, of course the parties are at loggerheads on all kinds of issues, on the debt and the national debt, and the budget deficit, and on unemployment, and on abortion, and gay rights. They are vigorously antagonistic on all those policies. Are they vigorously antagonistic on foreign policy? I don't think so. Not quite so much. Kind of paradoxically, because the Democratic president feels that he must be vigorous and even militant in foreign policy to protect himself from charges of being soft on national security. Now, before I conclude, though, I want to point out one place where there is a distinction between Democrats and Republicans on foreign policy. George W. Bush was clearly more militantly unilateral than Obama. President Obama has been clearly more multilateral. President Bush not only initiated a war in Iraq without getting Security Council approval, maybe even almost more importantly, he consistently claimed in writing in public the right to launch military initiatives without getting the approval of the Security Council. President Obama has been quite different. I don't have any question in my mind that if President Obama felt it was necessary, he would launch a military initiative without Security Council approval. But he doesn't claim the right to do it in advance. And for his major military initiative, the initiative against the Gaddafi regime in Libya, he got Security Council approval. U.S. Congress, not so much. But the Security Council approved of this initiative. And one of the results, I'm not sure you can see this, and I've got a table with it somewhat more visible. Public attitudes around the world toward the United States, toward the Obama administration compared to the Bush administration, they're much more positive. This table asks a somewhat different question. I don't know if you can see that or not, but this asks, to what extent are you confident that America will do the right thing in world affairs? Well, you look what the responses were under the Bush administration, they're all very low, most of them, and they're strikingly higher. I mean, even places like Germany went from 19% to 93% under Obama. And this is mostly because I would argue the Obama administration has been careful to preach a good multilateral game, to argue or to accept the role of the national or the UN Security Council. The change for the better has been especially dramatic in Arab countries and Muslim countries. Egypt, 8% to 42%. Pakistan, not so much. Lebanon is an increase. The one place that the Bush administration did have a good public opinion polling was in Africa. Because of the AIDS initiative, I think mostly. The highest in this column here, over here under the Bush administration, I'm pointing as if you can see it, I don't have a pointer, but look at Kenya and Nigeria. During the Bush administration, positive attitudes about the America's tendency to do the right thing, it's quite high in Kenya and Nigeria. But even in Kenya, despite the fact that it started off with a very high approval of the U.S. tendency to do the right thing, even in Kenya, the Obama administration has achieved a significant increase in pro-American feeling. Now, of course, we all understand that President Obama has a special advantage in Kenya. He was born there. Or maybe it was his father. Same difference. But the point is that there is a difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and it shows off in public opinion polling data, so that when President Obama last night says, when people say the U.S. is in decline and it has no clout overseas, it's lost its influence overseas, he says they don't know what they're talking about, I'm pretty sure it's data like these that makes him inclined to bring up that topic and makes him confidently declare that those statements are wrong. So, my bottom line is this. Polarization in the current era does drive American foreign policy. It leads Republicans to accuse Democrats of being soft on national security. It leads Democrats to be very wary of being accused of being soft on national security. It leads Obama to adopt more vigorous, even kind of militant policies than he would otherwise. Paradoxically, that means that I don't think there really is that much polarization on foreign policy issues or on the foreign policies that Democratic presidents and Republican presidents would adopt. And finally, I would say all this is driven by the premise or driven by the fact that leaders want to stay in power. And if I haven't convinced you of that, then I guess I would just suggest that you read my book. Thank you. Yes.
I appreciate your analysis. I just read Time magazine, this
Yes.
latest edition.
Right.
Very similar, and that's still a Republican magazine, I think, but they give him what's the name, Fareed Zakaria, whatever you call him, gave him good marks, maybe even excellent marks if if he continues that way. And also, the Republican candidates are not for the nomination haven't even touched the foreign issues because of this success of Obama.
They bring it up, but I think half-heartedly, not all that consistently. But I'm so glad you mentioned that article in Time magazine, because they left out a point that I wanted to mention. I think it's in that article, President Obama was asked, which president do you feel is most worthy of emulation in foreign policy? And his choice is George H.W. Bush. That makes my point about there's not any real foreign policy chasm there between the parties. And I think he says that because he was so well qualified and because he was successful. But I think it's very interesting that the Democratic president in a national interview, I'm sure it must irritate Bill Clinton to some extent, but nevertheless, Obama says, my hero, the president that I most want to emulate is George H.W. Bush. Yes?
I find it a real stretch to look at the Afghanistan situation under Carter and look at it as saying, deliberately, we provoked that to end the Cold War, and that actually worked. I think that's a...
Well, I wouldn't buy, I meant to have a facetious, okay, the question, she finds it hard to believe and to buy the argument that the Democratic President Carter intentionally provoked the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with the purpose of bringing an end to the Cold War. And I meant to describe Zbigniew Brzezinski's claims along those lines in a facetious manner. I'm not buying that part of it. I am quite confident, partly because Robert Gates wrote a book, and he was in the CIA for many years, and he was there. Robert Gates says specifically, and I could find it if you want me to, that this is what happened, that Brzezinski probably had the idea originally, and Jimmy Carter went along with it, and they were hoping to provoke the attack, and they did hope that it would lead to a Vietnam-type situation. For the Soviet Union, I doubt if they were so optimistic as to think, and this will end the Cold War, but I am quite confident that this was a plan by the Carter administration and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Yes?
Question, can you incorporate the religious right being part of the Republican Party with the Republican attitude towards foreign policy?
The question has to do with the role of the religious right in this process and the role of the religious right in accounting for Republican foreign policies. I guess not very well. I mean, it's clear to me that the religious right in the Republican Party does add a certain amount of zeal to Republican policies in favor of Israel. That's pretty clear to me. And of course, that's the one place where Obama, his ratings up here, Israel, not so much, -1. So off the top of my head, I guess that's the best I can come up with. The religious right does push the Republican Party to be more zealously pro-Israel than it would probably otherwise be.
But the religious right is also a proselytizing agent.
Right.
And proselytization, religious proselytization, would be consistent with a more hardline foreign policy.
Yes, it certainly would be, and probably especially against Islam and Islamist fundamentalists. But in spite of that, I would say that Obama has been pretty vigorously anti-Islamist, anti-terrorist.
Could
Yeah.
you comment on why the invasion in Libya down the road might be a bad idea?
Could I comment on why the invasion in Libya is a bad idea? I'm somewhat reluctant. I feel like a stick in the mud here, and I have a kind of natural tendency to believe, and I've read this, the interventions turn out badly. But let me make two main arguments. I mean, in general, I am somewhat suspicious of this general responsibility to protect, R2P. That was the rationale. It's going to result in rich, powerful countries invading poor, powerless countries, number one. You're not going to have interventions in richer countries that violate human rights. That's a kind of small problem. I guess, to answer briefly, I'm concerned about the moral hazard being the risk that this will inspire rebellions in other places where the United States and the Western world, the global community, cannot deal as they did in Libya. Syria is an example. That Syria has been inspired to some extent about Libya. What can the Western world do about what the United States can do about it? Nothing. Partly because they got the Russians and the Chinese to support the venture in Libya with the idea that all the UN was going to do, all the US was going to do, was just prevent Gaddafi from going into Benghazi. But then, once they did that, they took out after the regime. And the other reason that makes me a little bit concerned is that, you know, we had this sequence of events in Libya. You have Libya, Gaddafi pursuing nuclear weapons. He gets cajoled out of nuclear weapons. He gives up his nuclear weapons. He establishes reasonably good relationships with the United States, and then what happens? He gets invaded and deposed. What do you think Iran is going to think about that? What do you think North Koreans think about that? You need nuclear weapons to protect yourself against the United States. Look what happened to Libya. They had them, they gave them up, boom, it's gone. So it's going to create even more vigorous zeal on the part of Iran, for example. They're really going to feel we've got to have nuclear weapons. Look what happened to Iraq. They didn't have nuclear weapons. Look what happened to Libya. They didn't have nuclear weapons. That's one of the problems I see with it. Yes?
I'm curious about the timeline on this chart showing
Right.
2007 and 2009,
Mm-hmm.
and what a similar comparison might be either at the same time in George Bush's
Right.
presidency early on, and what the sentiment might be with regard to Obama today.
Right. That's a good point, and I couldn't find more recent data. I mean, I think that 2007 is a good year to reflect the impact of George Bush's foreign policies. I'm sure that before 9/11, Bush would have much better ratings, but that's part of the point, that Bush, in response to 9/11, I mean, George Bush came into office promising a less energetic foreign policy, a more modest foreign policy. We're not going to do any nation building. The Clinton administration pursued foreign policy as social work. We're not going to do any of that. We're going to follow the national interest and be more modest and more withdrawn. And then after 9/11, he adopted very different policies and unilateral policies. So 2007 is a good place to.
It's taken over by the neocon. The Bush.
Good place, I think, to look at the Bush administration. It would be better to have more recent data on the Obama administration. I haven't seen more recent data. Where would it change? I suspect it's not quite as glowing in favor of Obama, but I don't think that it's drastically different. That I don't think he's done anything to antagonize people in most of those countries. Yes?
Isn't it very possible that the numbers in 2009 for president were an expectation that he was going to make things better than they were at the end of the Bush
Right.
administration? Therefore, this was a hope as opposed to a real feeling.
Still a drastic difference.
Yes, I mean, you may be right. The glow is off the Obama administration. Maybe there had been some decline. I will try to look that up and see what I can find. It takes a while to put data like this together. It takes surveys all over the world to put them together. But he has consistently, despite the fact that the glow may be off in various ways, maybe more having to do with domestic economics than foreign policies, he has consistently been multilateral, and he's just consistently preached a good multilateral game, and he did get the Security Council approval for the venture in Libya. So I'm speculating, but it is speculation, that he's held up pretty well, and I guess the last thing I would say is he wouldn't have made the claim last night about America having clout abroad if he weren't aware that he could bring up data of this kind. Yes?
What's more important in a leader maintaining his power, local economics or foreign policy?
The question is, what is more important? And this is a very good political science question. It's even a good doctoral PhD student comprehensive exam question. What's more important than a leader holding on to power, domestic economics or foreign policy? Generally speaking, I don't think it's too debatable. I think domestic economics tends to be more important. And for that reason, even if you bought my argument entirely that Obama has pursued a vigorous foreign policy in response to the threat of being accused of being soft on national security and has been stunningly successful, he might still lose. And if he does, it will almost certainly be because, as impressed as people might be about his foreign policy successes, especially in killing bin Laden, of course, and that's what he ended his address with last night for very good reason, they're more concerned, and voters generally tend to be more.
That's what happened to his hero, H.W. Bush.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he had the tremendous, stunning success in the war in Iraq, and his approval ratings were in the 80s and 90%, and yet there was a recession when he was running for office, and he managed to lose that election, despite the fact that Obama says, and I would say, he in fact had a quite successful foreign policy. So I think that's fairly easy to answer. Generally speaking, domestic economics is more important for holding on to power than foreign policy. Yes?
Has there ever been any truth in the claim that politics stops at the water's edge? You say that all the time.
Has there ever been any truth to the claim that politics stops at the water's edge? Well, certainly the argument by those of us in the field these days who are arguing for the premise that leaders want to stay in power and arguing that's a better premise, that's a more fruitful premise than states pursue the national security in terms of power. The answer from that premise is no. It's never been true that politics stops at the water's edge, that all presidents all the time, all state leaders all the time use foreign policy in part, and they are concerned to a very great degree to use foreign policy to their political advantage, which of course is not a goal that their political opponents share. So, no, I don't think that ever has been true. Yes?
Yeah, but you might ask,
Yes?
you might ask, what about the voters? I think for many voters, it is the water's edge. If people, my feeling is if people are where they are today economically, so that's what's going to be the issue.
Okay, as I understand the comment is what about the people, what about the voters? And you're saying that the voters, the people are more concerned about economic issues than foreign policy issues? Yes,
Some people don't really pay any attention.
No, there's very little doubt that most people do not care and do not know much about foreign policy. I do not buy the argument that some people make on pointing at poll data about how ignorant Americans are about foreign policy, that therefore public opinion should have no impact on foreign policy. I think despite the fact that individuals do not know much, they take cues from opinion leaders, and if you look at the opinions of the majority of Americans in the aggregate, they tend to take pretty reasonable positions on foreign policy, in spite of the fact that individual Americans don't tend to know much about foreign policy. But nevertheless, your original point that most Americans care more about economics, domestic economics, than foreign policy most of the time, I don't quarrel with that. Yes?
American companies have a lot of interest in China.
Right.
Businesses still don't someone like Hillary Clinton and all these policy people, don't they realize that those businesses would be in jeopardy if we're too aggressive there?
The question is, do not American foreign policymakers like Secretary of State Clinton and Obama understand that tension with China might cost American businesses who have extensive interests in China? And there is, of course, a long-standing principle and theme and idea that trade and economic ties between countries create peace. And I think it is probably the case that those extensive economic ties and the interests of the American business community in China make it less likely that the United States and China will become seriously antagonistic, become engaged in military conflict. However, Europe before World War I was extraordinarily closely tied together in terms of trade and foreign investment. France and Germany had an extraordinarily intense economic relationship. Nevertheless, World War I occurred. And when Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor, the United States was its leading trading partner. So yes, I think there is a healthy push in that direction, but I think it would be wrong to count on that by itself to preserve peaceful relations between the United States and China. Yes?
I was just adding to what you were saying there.
Yeah.
We still have a diabolical different approach, and we tend to just not talk about that. That China is truly a communist country. You know, we have different interests, I guess I'm
Yeah.
saying. Businesses, they don't really care. Doesn't seem to, as long as they're able to exercise that. But the long-range goals of the communist country still not really that pro-American.
Okay. The point is that China and the United States are very different, and that China is still communist, and that China and the United States have different interests. No, I agree that China and the United States have different interests. I'm not sure I agree that, what? Long-term goals, clearly. I mean, China would like to control things and would like to become influential, especially in their part of the world, to an extent the United States would object to and will try to prevent, and that's why this pivot toward Asia, which seems to be Hillary Clinton's idea as much as anybody's, interestingly enough. So yes, they have different interests. I'm not so sure that I agree that China is really, really communist. The Communist Party is still in control. It is still godless and atheistic, like the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are not. But it's not communist in the sense that it aspires to spread its kind of political system around the world, as it definitely did in the era of Mao Zedong, for example. To that extent, it's become quite different. It doesn't any longer claim that it has the kind of political system that everybody in the world should adopt. Yes. Thank you.
I think let me ask the questions about the relationship between approval rating and the economy. The two things do go hand in hand. That is, right now, Obama's approval rating isn't very good because the economy isn't very good. But it turns out that if the election were held today, Barack Obama would be in deep trouble, but it's not being held today. And it turns out that 6 months down the road, things could change a lot. And we've seen over the course of history big shifts in approval. I mean, you think about something like 9/11 and how that just shot Bush's approval through the roof because of the horrible events of that particular day, and then, would move up and down. And, you saw Obama get a boost in popularity right following the killing of Osama bin Laden. So there's a lot of things that could go on. And, a 6 months in politics is, in fact, to use an overused phrase, a lifetime in politics. So they do matter. It just matters that we know our elections are at a fixed time, and there's also a certain element of luck to when they happen to be scheduled. So does Barack Obama get lucky and the economy really starts cooking just before the election? Or do you get unlucky like George Bush did, Bush 1, where the economy started cooking right after the election was cast and, in fact, was doing pretty well, but Bush got no credit? We're out of time. Okay, sorry.
Test do not compare favorably to other areas in other countries. Is that a fair?
Well, nationally, I can't speak to those.
Okay, nationally. Would anybody care to address that issue?